Okay. So I want to talk about Wuthering Waves. This game has gone on my radar recently, and there have been many creators like Tectone, Mr. Pokey, Gotcha Smack, and Mtash who I watch and who have been speaking very optimistically about this game. Optimistic enough to call it the Genshin killer. Personally, I was hesitant to believe it until I saw the gameplay trailer that was just released, and when I saw that combat system and open world and in the trailer, it more than just piqued my interest. Now, there's not much I can critique and not much I can look at in the trailer itself, so to get a better idea of what Wuthering Waves would be like, I recently started playing Punishing Grey Raven. Punishing Grey Raven is another game by Crow Games, by the way, and the reason I want to go to it is just to see what the combat system looks like, how they deliver the story, what their UI looks like, that sort of general stuff, because I'm assuming most of that stuff might be similar, hopefully updated, just because Punishing Grey Raven came out quite a while ago. And based on my experience in Punishing Grey Raven over the past week, I do have some concerns, especially if it's trying to pull in that casual gaming crowd, or if it's trying to be the next Genshin killer. First off, let me preface this by saying that I haven't looked into any of the combat guides for Punishing Grey Raven. Everything is through the in-game tutorials and what I learned through the combat itself. And this, to me, should give a good representation about what the casual player will understand, what they'll see, and what how they'll interact with this game itself. And personally, from my own experiences, I haven't played many of these games. I haven't played Genshin Impact. I haven't played Honkai Impact Third. Recently, the only game that I've really played seriously is Honkai Star Rail. So, from my experience of Punishing Grey Raven, there is a lot in there that I just don't understand, but I'm able to work through it. There's enough tutorials for me to figure everything out. I will say though, the combat experience is phenomenal. It does get you really immersed. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to interact with. There's a lot of ways to get immersed into the combat. However, it is not the most mobile friendly, and it's not even, I'd say, even the most PC friendly combat system. There are about 100 things you need to be imagining during the combats. Your two hands, first of all, one is going to be on your WASD movement, and the other hand will be controlling camera movements on the mouse. All your fingers, the rest of your fingers will be spread across hitting your basic attack, your ultimates, your dodges, and then there are these 8 pings in this combat system, which is an interesting twist to the combat that Crow Games has put into this game. If you're on mobile, then in my opinion, you have to be a very dedicated player to be as good as someone who's on the mouse and keyboard, just because there are so many buttons you need to be managing and hitting, and so many things you need to be listening for, looking for especially for bosses, and you just need to be watching for their telegraph movement. I think that Crow Games might have gone a little too zealous about the combat and possibly made the combat a little not too complicated, but too busy. There's too many things going on. I think the combat would have been just as interesting without the ping system and instead having skill buttons on cooldown instead. To Wuthering Waves' credit, it does seem they have reduced this unnecessary clutter. From the gameplay trailer, it looks like there's going to be one ultimate, one skill, and one basic attack that you keep on spamming throughout the combat. There also seems to be a mount button and a technique button. The mount button summons your mount and uses whatever the mount skill is, and it seems to help with the open world exploration. I'm not sure if it's being used in the combat system as well. The technique button is more of an open world exploration, it looks like. It seems to have a radar skill and a grappling skill in there, among many other things. And it just looks like it's something to help you traversing the open world and exploring the open world. There also seems to be some sort of auto-targeting system. Again, I can't speak to it. I don't know what it does, but hopefully it will be something that it's reliable to help alleviate some of that pressure on the mobile players at least. Personally, I can respect Crow Games for trying the new combat system in Punishing Grey Raven, but to me, it seems more like a combat game mixed with a Candy Crush. I personally prefer the combat system that is in Wuthering Waves, so I like the direction that the Wuthering Waves dev team is putting the game in. And again, this is nothing bad about Punch and Grey Raven's combat. It just has a relatively steep learning curve, which would have scared away most of the casual players who just want to jump in and do good damage and get involved in the combat and the story. Now you might be saying, hey Vass, why are you talking about the casual players? We don't want the casual players. They can play the game if they want to, they can leave if they want to. We don't care. And I can understand that as sentiment. It's not technically a bad one, but if this game is trying to set itself to be a Genshin Impact killer, if you want this game to be a Genshin Impact killer, it needs to be casual friendly. It needs to have an ease of access to learning the combat system, and it should be rewarding for that lower level of investment. Now, if it has a steep learning curve after that initial learning period, that's completely fine. And I do agree that this game should have that, and it should reward those players who do invest time into learning the combat, into learning the kits, and into optimizing all these minute things. It's one thing that Genshin Impact has failed at doing, and it's the thing that Wuthering Waves can optimize and capitalize on to capture that crowd and reward those players who are invested in the game. But you can't ignore the fact that the reason Genshin Impact is so popular is not because of its combat system, it's not even entirely because of its story, it's because of its simplicity. It's easy for casual players to log in, join, do their dailies, experience the story, experience the gameplay, and then just leave. There's not much thought that needs to be put in, there's not much investment that they have to do. It's just join, play your minigames, do your dailies, and leave. If Wuthering Waves can't have that similar sort of system where you don't need to optimize kits, you don't need to optimize your relics or whatever the equivalent is in this game to progress through at least the story, it will fail at being the Genshin killer. Now, in terms of combat, more important than the combat itself in Wuthering Waves, what's more important, I would say, is the bosses and endgame content that requires the players to put a little more thought into their combat decisions and character building. And I trust Kuro Games to actually do this, because the few bosses I have fought in Punch and Grey Raven have been an absolute blast to fight. Personally, I hope that the bosses end up being more of a skill check instead of a DPS check. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean not being timed to clear the content. There have been some bosses currently that I've been fighting in Punch and Grey Raven, which are some event bosses, where because I'm a little too level, I can't really beat in the current time, but I would have loved to at least have the full fight completed until I die or until the boss dies. But combat alone will not make Wuthering Waves a Genshin killer. In fact, even more important than combat itself, in order to be a Genshin killer, it needs to have a good story. And I'm not talking about just the content of the story needs to be amazing. I'm talking about also the execution of it and the directing of it. At the end of the day, these gacha games, they're marketed as anime games. They're marketed towards the anime community. And the reason the anime community joins in on these games is because they want to be part of this epic story and experience these hype moments a little bit more vividly than watching it on a screen. That is the main draw of these gacha games, and based on Punch and Grey Raven, my hopes aren't set too high. I've heard the story in Punch and Grey Raven gets good, but emphasis on heard because I've not reached it yet. Over the past week, I've been playing on and off, and I've recently finished chapter 4, and there are about 20-ish chapters currently in the game, and honestly, if I played a little bit more diligently and focused on that story, on the story content, I probably would have completed all the stories by now. But I'd say, for the casual player, they're gonna make a critical judgment just in these first 4 chapters. These new players, when they start this game, when they pick it up, they will decide if they want to continue with this game or drop this game within the first 2 chapters of the game. These first few chapters are the player's first impression of this game, and this impression informs them if they like this game and if they want to continue playing or to drop the game. In anime, reviewers will often recommend giving a series 3 episodes before making a decision to continue watching or to drop the show. This is just a similar thing happening in these games. There's a reason why in Honkai Star Rail, Belobog's story had to be as good as it was on launch. If that story wasn't as good as it was, I don't think Honkai Star Rail would have retained as many players as it has, and I don't think Honkai Star Rail would have been as popular as it has. At the end of the day, the story is what keeps the casual player base invested in the game. The combat can be amazing, but the story is what contextualizes the stakes of the battles of the combat that is happening. Without a good enough reason to be in the fight itself becomes meaningless to the players. And as soon as those fights become meaningless, the game loses that casual player base. If Wuthering Waves wants to be the Genshin killer, it needs to draw in those players and keep them. Now, I do think there are some issues I had with Punishing Gray Raven's story that I won't have with Wuthering Waves' story. Primarily, I believe the cutscenes and dialogue will be voiced in Wuthering Waves and directed in a 3D environment. This is opposed to Punishing Gray Raven, who uses more of a visual novel technique to execute their story. And it's possible that I simply don't like visual novels, or that I haven't read enough visual novels to enjoy the medium. However, there are things that you lack in visual novels that story scenes in Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail would have. There's emotion in the voices, there's body language that you can see, and more importantly, there's pacing. I remember going through Punch and Gray Raven's story, and there was one character who seemed very serious based on how they held themselves in their PNG and the lines they were saying. And then all of a sudden, there was this tonal shift that I just didn't understand. And I had to reread the lines to understand what was the tonality of what they were saying. And I had to restructure what this character was, who they were in my mind, and I had to recharacterize them. This is something you won't see in Honkai Star Rail or Genshin Impact, just because so much of their character is expressed through their voices, through their body language. Now, you might argue that books have none of these and can still be some of the most immersive mediums. And I would agree, but I think the second problem that comes from involving a visual novel storytelling method in an action RPG game is that you have such a drastic change in engagement with the content. 1 second, you're whipping your mouse, clicking as fast as you can, listening, looking for telegraphed boss movements, and the next you're sitting there reading through some dialogue, trying to imagine the tonality and expressions of these characters. It's a sort of mental whiplash that would encourage players to just skip the story, in my opinion. In this example of a book, the execution of story is consistent. It's all through words, and it's all in your head. You're just imagining how everything is playing out. You're not just reading Dune, getting yourself immersed in the world, and then as soon as you flip this one page, a handful of sand is thrown in your face. I'm sure there are some people out there who would say that is immersive. As the characters are walking through a desert and in a sandstorm, and all of a sudden you get sand thrown in your face, you are experiencing what they're experiencing. You are feeling what they're feeling. But I think everyone, or most everyone, would say that this would break their immersion. It would pull them out of the immersiveness of the book. This is what I'm saying about Punishing Gray Raven. You're in this 3D environment, you're engaged with the combat, and then all of a sudden, you're kind of just pulled out into this visual novel. It's two different types of immersion that you have to switch between, and that can be a little drastic and give you a little bit of whiplash. Now, like I said before, Wuthering Waves is a 3D open world game, and in the year 2024, I'm hoping them to be able to meld the combat and the story together a little bit more seamlessly, like in Honkai Star Rail or in Genshin Impact. The other thing I'm optimistic about is that in one of their developer notes, developer videos, they said they rewrote 90% of the story, and that sounds amazing. It means that they are putting an effort into the story itself. But it also kind of worries me, because if they had to rewrite 90% of the story, how bad was the story before? What was wrong with the story before that almost all of it had to be rewritten? And most importantly, are they rushing to write this story? I hope that they have a dedicated team of story writers, story directors, who aren't just working on a good story, who are working on execution and pacing. Because that's one of the things, at least in Honkai Star Rail, that needs immense improvement. The Bellbog story was great, but in the Jianzhou Lofu, I think they could have handled the pacing of the character arcs and the story elements a lot better. The story itself would have been longer, but I think the story beats and the moments, and the hype moments at least, would have hit a lot harder. If the Wuthering Waves development team can figure out how to develop a combat system that's simple enough to understand for casual players, and then also develop a story that can really immerse that casual player base, I think they have a real chance at killing Genshin. That's all I have to say on this topic. Hopefully my rambles have made some sense. Comment what you think. I love to start a discussion to see what other people in the community think or what they value in a successful game. If you like my commentary style, like and subscribe. I'm going to try and do more commentaries about Honkai Star Rail and Wuthering Waves at least. But that's all. Have a good one. Bye.